There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being judged by people who've never walked a day in your worn boots. Maebry Holt knew that feeling well when she stepped into the auction pen at Saddle's End, wearing the same patched coat she'd worn for 20 years. The crowd laughed at her clothes, at the tin cups rattling from her pack, at the idea that a mountain woman like her belonged anywhere near their gathering. Her horse, Rue, stood waiting in the pen, taken from her over a land dispute she'd refused to fight in court. When the bidding started, Maebry raised her hand and kept it raised, going higher than anyone thought possible. Where did that money come from, and what would it cost everyone to find out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains above Saddle's End had been Maebry Holt's home for 37 years, though most folks in town below could barely remember a time when she came down more than twice a season. Her cabin sat tucked into a pine-covered ridge where the air stayed thin and cold even in summer, where the wind carried the smell of juniper and sage, and where a person could go weeks without hearing another human voice. That suited Maebry just fine. She'd built a life up there that made sense to her, a life measured in wood, chopped and water carried, in seasons turning and snow melting, in the quiet companionship of one chestnut gelding named Rue. Rue had come to her 15 years back, already grown but mistreated, his ribs showing and his spirit nearly broken. Maebry had traded a winter's worth of preserved venison to a passing trader who'd won the horse in a card game and didn't know what to do with him. The trader had been happy to be rid of an animal he considered worthless. Maebry saw something different. She saw the intelligence in Rue's dark eyes, the way he held himself despite the hunger, the dignity that suffering hadn't quite stolen. Those first months had been a conversation between two cautious souls. Maebry would sit on her porch in the evenings, speaking low to Rue as he grazed nearby, never approaching until he was ready. She'd leave grain where he could find it, fresh water in a clean trough, a shelter he could choose to enter or ignore. Slowly, carefully, Rue learned that this place was different, that this woman's hands brought food, not pain, that her voice meant safety. The day he first walked up to her porch and nuzzled her shoulder, Maebry had cried. Not loud or dramatic, just quiet tears that came from some deep well of loneliness she hadn't known she was carrying. After that, they were partners. Rue pulled her cart down to town for supplies. He carried her up to the high meadows where the best herbs grew. He stood patient while she loaded him with firewood, and he nickered soft greetings when she emerged from the cabin each dawn. Tholhaisa, husband Joseph, had been gone 18 years now. Killed in a mining accident over in Copper Ridge, crushed when a support timber gave way. They'd been married 22 years by then, had built the cabin together, had chosen this remote life together. Joseph had worked the mines seasonally, dangerous work that paid enough to keep them through the winters. Maebry had tended their small garden, preserved food, trapped and hunted. They'd been happy in their solitude, content with each other's company and the rhythm of mountain living. When Joseph died, folks in Saddle's End had expected Maebry to sell up and move to town, maybe live with kin if she had any. She had no intention of doing either. The cabin held every good memory she possessed. The land was hers and Joseph's, paid for with his mining wages and her labor. She would stay until the mountains took her too, and she made that clear to anyone who suggested otherwise. The town below had changed considerably in the years since Joseph's death. Saddle's End had grown from a rough collection of mining supply stores and saloons into something that aspired to respectability. There was a proper church now, a school building, even a small library funded by some distant benefactor who'd made money in silver and wanted to be remembered kindly. With growth came new people, and with new people came new ways of doing business. Byron Sutton had arrived in Saddle's End about 7 years ago, though Maebry had only become aware of him in the past 2. He presented himself as a land agent, someone who helped settle disputes and clarify ownership in a region where many properties had murky titles dating back to territorial days. On the surface, his services seemed useful. Plenty of folks around Saddle's End held land their grandparents had claimed and worked but never properly filed on. Sutton would research titles, file the correct paperwork, and charge a modest fee for his trouble. What Maebry didn't know, because she rarely came to town and listened even less to gossip, was that Sutton's modest fees often turned into much larger claims. He would find some technicality, some missing form or unsigned document, and suddenly the land was in dispute. Sometimes he'd purchase the claim himself through a shell company. Sometimes he'd arrange for it to be seized and auctioned, then ensure a business partner won the bid. Either way, Sutton profited, and the original owners found themselves landless, with no legal recourse they could afford. Hamilton Greaves, the town's auctioneer, had been part of Saddle's End longer than Sutton, but he'd found a profitable partnership in the land agent's schemes. Greaves ran the monthly auctions where seized property, abandoned goods, and estate sales were handled. He was a florid man with a voice that carried and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd grown wealthy on his percentages, and he wasn't particular about where the items he sold came from, as long as the paperwork looked legitimate enough. There was one man in town who'd begun to question the pattern of seizures and sales, though his position made it difficult for him to act. Kenny Marsh had been a deputy for 3 years, young enough to still believe the law should mean something, old enough to recognize when it was being twisted. He'd started noticing how often Sutton's name appeared on property transfers, how many families had lost land to bureaucratic tangles that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Marsh had no proof of wrongdoing, just a growing unease. The sheriff was an older man counting days to retirement, uninterested in complications that might delay his pension. When Marsh raised questions, he was told to focus on keeping drunks out of the street and letting the courts handle property matters. But Marsh kept his own notes, copied records when he could, and waited for something solid enough to act on. Maebry knew none of this. She came to town perhaps 3 times a year, always in the same worn duster coat that had belonged to Joseph, patched at the elbows and faded to a color somewhere between brown and gray. She carried her tin cups on a chain at her belt, the same cups she used for creek water when traveling. She wore practical boots and men's trousers, because dresses made no sense for mountain living. The townspeople stared and whispered, called her eccentric or worse, but Maebry had stopped caring what strangers thought decades ago. Her land trouble had started innocuously enough. A letter arrived one spring, delivered by a postal rider who'd made the long trip up to her cabin. The letter, on official-looking paper, informed her that there was a question about her property title. The original deed had apparently been filed in the wrong county, and while this didn't necessarily invalidate her claim, it needed to be corrected. She was invited to visit the land office in Saddle's End to resolve the matter. Maebry had read the letter twice, then used it to start her cook fire. She and Joseph had bought the land legal and proper, paid in full with mining wages. They'd filed the deed where they were told to file it. If someone had made a mistake, it wasn't her mistake, and she saw no reason to waste days traveling to town to argue about it. The land was hers. She lived on it, worked it, and would die on it. A piece of paper in the wrong file cabinet didn't change those facts. But Byron Sutton was a patient man when it came to profit. When Maebry ignored the first letter, he sent another. then another. Each one used slightly stronger language, hinted at more serious consequences. Maebry burned them all. She'd seen men like Sutton before, men who used papers and offices to take what they couldn't earn. She wanted no part of their system. The final letter hadn't been a request. It was a notice that her property had been seized due to inability to prove ownership and failure to respond to official inquiries. Furthermore, her horse, Rue, as an asset located on disputed property, was also subject to seizure and would be sold at auction to offset administrative costs. That letter Maebry hadn't burned. She'd sat on her porch holding it, reading it over and over until the words blurred. They were taking Rue, her companion, her partner, the one living creature who depended on her and who she depended on, taking him to sell like he was a piece of furniture, like the bond between them meant nothing. Deputy Marsh had been the one who came to enforce the seizure. He'd ridden up to her cabin on a grey morning, with clouds threatening snow, and the look on his face told Maebry he hated his job that day. He'd been respectful, apologetic even, but firm. The law required the seizure. He had the papers. Rue had to come with him. Maebry had considered fighting. She owned a rifle, knew how to use it. But she also knew that pointing a gun at a deputy would solve nothing and end with her in jail or worse. So she'd stood on her porch, arms crossed, and watched as Marsh led Rue down the mountain trail. The horse had looked back once, confused, and that look had nearly broken her. For 3 days after, Maebry had barely moved. She sat on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the empty space where Rue's shelter stood. She didn't eat, barely slept. The cabin felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. The silence, which had always been companionable, now pressed down like a physical weight. On the 4th day, she'd forced herself to stand, to move, to think. Sitting and grieving wouldn't bring Rue back. She needed a plan. The auction notice had been included with the seizure papers. Rue would be sold in 1 week at the monthly livestock auction in Saddle's End. Maebry began to consider what that meant. She had some money. Not much, but some. Joseph had always insisted they keep cash hidden in the cabin for emergencies. She'd added to it over the years, selling herbs and preserved goods to the occasional trader. It was enough to live on if she was careful, enough to buy supplies for a year, maybe 2. But would it be enough to buy Rue back? Maebry counted her savings 3 times. The total was respectable, but probably not enough for a healthy horse at auction. Horses brought good money, especially well-trained geldings like Rue. She sat at her rough wooden table, staring at the bills and coins spread before her, and felt despair creeping back. That's when she remembered Joseph's lockbox. He'd shown it to her once, years ago, before a particularly dangerous stint in the mines. He'd told her where it was hidden, told her what was in it, told her it was for dire emergencies only. If something happened to him, she was to use it to survive. Otherwise, it stayed hidden and untouched. Maebry had forgotten about it, or perhaps chosen to forget. Using that money felt like admitting Joseph was truly gone, like accepting that the emergency he'd feared had come to pass. But losing Rue was an emergency. Joseph would have understood that. She found the lockbox behind a loose stone in the cabin's foundation, exactly where Joseph had said. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was more money than she'd expected. Joseph had saved carefully from every mining job, setting aside what he could. There was also a small leather journal, his handwriting recording every dollar earned and saved. Looking at those entries, the careful accounting of a man trying to build security for his wife, Maebry felt tears come again. With the lockbox money added to her savings, she had enough. Enough to bid seriously at the auction, enough to fight for Rue. It would leave her with almost nothing in reserve. But Maebry had lived lean before. She could do it again. The decision made, Maebry prepared for the journey to Saddle's End. She packed light, just what she'd need for a couple of days. She cleaned herself up as best she could, braided her grey hair tight, and put on the same clothes she always wore to town, the duster coat, the tin cups, the practical boots. This was who she was. She wouldn't pretend to be something else to make townspeople comfortable. As she closed up the cabin and began the long walk down to Saddle's End, Maebry Holt had no idea she was about to become the centre of something much larger than getting her horse back. She couldn't know that her simple act of showing up to bid at an auction would expose corruption, rally a community, and prove that underestimating a mountain woman was a mistake people only made once. All she knew was that Rue needed her, and she'd move heaven and earth to bring him home. The walk down from the mountain took Maebry most of a day. The trail was familiar to her feet, every switchback and rocky stretch committed to memory from years of travel. She carried her pack with the money carefully wrapped and hidden in the bottom, beneath a layer of practical supplies that wouldn't draw attention. The weight of it felt significant, not just physically, but in what it represented. Joseph's labor, her security, everything she had left in the world beyond the cabin itself. She reached the outskirts of Saddle's End as the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she'd been in any mood to appreciate them. The town had electric lights now in some places, a change from her last visit. She could hear music coming from one of the saloons, laughter and conversation drifting on the evening air. It all felt foreign to her, like stepping into a world she'd never quite belonged to, even when she'd visited more regularly. Maebry had no intention of paying for a room at the boarding house. That would waste money she might need for bidding, and besides, she preferred sleeping under stars to sleeping under a roof that belonged to strangers. She found a spot on the edge of town, near a stand of cottonwood trees that offered some privacy, and made a simple camp. She ate dried meat and hard biscuit from her pack, drank water from her tin cup filled at a public pump, and tried not to think too much about what tomorrow would bring. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rue's face, looking back at her as Deputy Marsh led him away. She wondered if they were feeding him properly, if they'd noticed he preferred to eat slowly and didn't like loud noises near his stall. Stupid thoughts, probably, but they circled through her mind nonetheless. Morning arrived, cold and bright. Maebry rose with the sun, packed her bedroll, and made her way into town proper. The auction wasn't until afternoon, but she wanted to see Rue, needed to reassure herself he was all right. The auction yard sat on the east side of town, a collection of pens and a covered platform where Hamilton Greaves conducted his business. She found Rue in a pen with several other horses, standing apart from them near the far fence. When he saw her approach, his ears pricked forward, and he crossed the pen in quick strides, pushing his nose through the rails to nuzzle her hands. Maebry pressed her forehead against his neck, breathing in the familiar smell of him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I'm going to get you back," she whispered. "I promise you that." Rue snorted softly, as if he understood and believed her. A voice behind her made Maebry turn. "He's a good horse. Shame about how he ended up here." Deputy Marsh stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands. He looked uncomfortable, which Maebry supposed he should be. "You did your job," she said flatly. No point apologizing for it now. "Wasn't going to apologize," Marsh said. "Was going to say, I hope you win the bid. For what that's worth." Maebry studied him, this young man who'd taken her horse on someone else's orders. His face was honest, troubled. "You think something's wrong with how this happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. Marsh glanced around, making sure they were alone. I think a lot of things are wrong with how property gets seized in this town. I think Byron Sutton's gotten rich off of complications that never used to exist. And I think Hamilton Greaves asks fewer questions than an auctioneer should. He met her eyes. But thinking something and proving it are different matters. I'm not interested in proving anything, Maebry said. I'm interested in taking my horse home. Fair enough. Marsh settled his hat back on his head. Auction starts at 2 o'clock. I'll be there, keeping order. If things get heated, stay calm. Don't give anyone an excuse to throw you out. Maebry nodded. Appreciate the warning. After Marsh left, Maebry spent another few minutes with Rue, then forced herself to walk away. She needed to eat something, needed to settle her nerves. She found a small cafe that served breakfast and ordered eggs and coffee, sitting at a corner table where she could watch the street. Other diners stared at her. A few whispered. Maebry ignored them all, focusing on her food. She'd learned long ago that people would judge regardless of what she did or how she looked. Their opinions didn't pay her bills or warm her cabin, so they didn't merit her concern. The hours until 2 o'clock crawled past. Maebry walked the town, observing changes since her last visit, trying to distract herself from the knot of anxiety in her stomach. A new dry goods store had opened. The hotel had been painted. There was a banner advertising an upcoming social dance, which struck Maebry as absurd. People getting dressed up to walk in circles to music when there was work to be done. But that was town life, she supposed, different from mountain life in every way that mattered. As the afternoon approached, people began drifting toward the auction yard. Maebry followed at a distance, not wanting to arrive too early and stand under scrutiny longer than necessary. When she finally entered the yard, a crowd had already gathered. Ranch hands looking for workhorses, townspeople treating it as entertainment, and several men in suits who had the look of money and business about them. Byron Sutton stood near the auction platform, talking with Hamilton Greaves. Maebry recognized Sutton from a description Deputy Marsh had given her years ago during some unrelated business. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that seemed calculated for effect. Greaves was shorter, rounder, his face already flushed though the auction hadn't started. When Sutton's gaze swept the crowd and landed on Maebry, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or assessment. He leaned over to say something to Greaves, and both men looked at her. Then Sutton smiled, the kind of smile a cat might give a cornered mouse, and Maebry felt her spine stiffen. Let them look, let them think what they wanted. She was here for Rue, nothing more. The auction began with smaller items, tools, furniture, odds and ends from estate sales. Maebry watched the process, learning the rhythm of it. Greaves would describe the item, start the bidding low, and work the crowd until prices climbed. He was good at his job, she had to admit. He knew how to make people competitive, how to squeeze extra dollars from pride and impulse. She waited through a dozen lots, her heart beating faster as they moved closer to the livestock. Other horses went first, selling for various prices depending on age and condition. Then Greaves called out, "Next we have Lot 47, one chestnut gelding, approximately 12 years old, well-trained to saddle and cart." Rue was led out by a ranch hand. The horse's ears were back, his movements stiff with distrust. He didn't like being handled by strangers. "We'll start the bidding at $20, Greaves announced. "Who'll give me 20? It was an insultingly low price, and Maebry knew it was deliberate. Starting low would make the auction seem fair, give the Ayahio illusion of opportunity. But the real bidders, the ones with money and connections, would drive the price up soon enough. A hand went up from the crowd. 20. Another voice. 25. Maebry raised her hand. 30. The crowd's attention shifted to her, and she heard laughter ripple through the assembly. Someone made a comment she didn't quite catch, something about mountain folk and pennies. More laughter followed. Greaves peered at her. $30 from the lady in the back. Do I hear 35? 35, called a rancher near the front. Maebry's voice came clear and steady. 40. More laughter, but with an edge of curiosity now. Who was this woman, and where did she think she was getting money to bid? The rancher bid again. 45. 50, Maebry said. This time the laughter was nervous, uncertain. $50 was real money, more than most expected her to have. Sutton's smile had faded. He was watching her closely now, reassessing. The bidding continued, climbing higher. Each time someone else bid, Maebry counted. She kept her voice level, her face calm, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The money in her pack would cover this, had to cover this. She couldn't let herself think about what would happen if it didn't. At $75, most of the casual bidders dropped out. At 80, the rancher shook his head and stepped back. That left only Maebry and one other man, someone she didn't recognize, who kept glancing at Byron Sutton as if waiting for a signal. 85, the man said. 90, Maebry responded immediately. Greaves was sweating now, though whether from excitement or nervousness she couldn't tell. $90. Do I hear 95? The man looked at Sutton. Sutton gave a small nod. 95. Maebry felt the money in her pack, felt the weight of Joseph's savings and her own careful accumulation. She had more than 95. She had enough to go higher, but going higher meant less security, less of a cushion against lean times ahead. Then she looked at Rue, standing confused in the center of attention, and knew there was no real choice at all. $100, she said, and her voice carried across the suddenly silent crowd. The silence following Maebry's bid lasted only a moment before the whispers began. $100 was serious money, more than most folks in Saddle's End made in 3 months of honest work. The crowd shifted, craning to get a better look at this mountain woman who apparently had resources no one had suspected. Byron Sutton's face had gone hard. All pretense of amusement vanished. He leaned close to his proxy bidder, speaking urgently in his ear. The man nodded and raised his hand. 110, he called out. Maebry didn't hesitate. 120. Greaves was stammering now, his usual showmanship faltering. $120. This is quite the bidding war, folks. Do I hear 130? The proxy looked strained. Sutton was probably paying him a flat fee to bid, and watching that fee evaporate with each increase. 130, he managed. 140, Maebry said. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Where's she getting that kind of money?" The question rippled through the assembly, growing louder. A few people near Maebry stepped back, as if suddenly wary of her. Deputy Marsh had positioned himself closer to the platform, his hand resting casually on his belt near his pistol. Not a threat, just a reminder that there were rules here, laws to keep. His eyes kept moving between Maebry, Sutton, and the crowd, reading the temperature of the situation. Sutton himself stepped forward now, abandoning his proxy. $150, he announced, and his voice carried clear authority. This was no longer about the horse. This was about control, about not being challenged by someone he'd already dismissed as powerless. Maebry met his stare across the crowd. In his eyes, she saw anger, wounded pride, and something darker, a calculation about how to turn this situation to his advantage. She'd seen men like him before. Men who couldn't stand being beaten, especially not by a woman, especially not by someone they considered beneath them. 160, she said, quietly. But in the silence, everyone heard. A woman's voice rose from the crowd, older and sharp with indignation. Hamilton Greaves, I want to know if this is even legal. Where's a mountain hermit getting this kind of cash? Is it stolen? Greaves looked relieved to have the question raised by someone else. That's a fair concern, Mrs. Hobson. Ma'am, he addressed Maebry, I'm going to need to see proof you can actually pay if you win this bid. Maebry had expected this. She'd known from the moment she decided to come that her presence would be questioned, her legitimacy challenged. She reached into her pack, moving slowly and deliberately, so no one would mistake the gesture for reaching for a weapon. From the bottom, beneath her spare shirt and provisions, she pulled out the cloth-wrapped bundle that contained her and Joseph's life savings. She walked forward through the crowd, which parted before her like water. When she reached the auction platform, she laid the bundle on the table beside Greaves and unwrapped it. Bills, carefully sorted and stacked, coins in neat rolls, every dollar accounted for. Count it if you need to, she said. It's honest money, earned and saved legal. Greaves stared at the cash, then at her. His hands trembled slightly as he began sorting through the bills. The crowd pressed closer, trying to see. Deputy Marsh moved to keep them back, maintaining a clear space around the table. Where did you get this? Sutton demanded, stepping up beside Greaves. How do we know it's legitimate? Maebry turned to face him directly. My husband worked the mines for 22 years. Dangerous work that paid fair. He saved what he could. I've added to it over the years, selling herbs and preserved goods. Every dollar there was earned with honest labor or fair trade. Can you prove that? Sutton pressed. Can you prove it wasn't? Maebry shot back. Last I checked, having money wasn't a crime. Neither is bidding at a public auction. Deputy Marsh stepped forward. Mr. Sutton, unless you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, the lady's money is as good as anyone's. This is a public auction, advertised, legal and proper. She's got a right to bid. I want to know where she's been hiding this kind of cash, Sutton insisted. People don't just appear with hundreds of dollars out of nowhere. An older man in the crowd spoke up, his voice weathered but strong. I knew her husband, Joseph Holt, worked alongside him in the Copper Ridge mines for near 15 years. He was a saving man, careful with his wages. If he put aside money, it's because he earned it honest, same as any of us. A few other voices murmured agreement. Apparently Joseph had been better remembered in Saddle's End than Maebry had realized. Greaves finished his count and looked up, his face pale. It's all here and then some. $230 total. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $230 was more than many families saw in a year. It represented security, possibility, a buffer against hard times. And this mountain woman, this person they'd dismissed and mocked, had been carrying it all along. Sutton's jaw clenched. He looked at the money, at Maebry, at the watching crowd. I bid 170, he said. Maebry gathered the money calmly, leaving out enough to cover the bid plus a margin for safety. She wrapped the rest and returned it to her pack. Then she met Sutton's gaze. 180. 190, Sutton snapped. 200, Maebry said. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the background noise of the town seemed to have faded, as if all of Saddle's End was holding its breath. This was no longer an auction for a horse. This was a test of wills, a clash between someone who'd always had power and someone who'd been counted as nothing. Sutton's face had gone red. He was breathing hard, his hands balled into fists at his sides. $210, he said through clenched teeth. Maebry looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Joseph, about the cabin, about the winters ahead with almost no reserves. She thought about what this money represented. Years of careful survival, of going without, of making every dollar stretch as far as it could go. Then she looked at Rue, still standing patient and confused in the center of the yard. Her horse, her companion, her family. 220, she said. Sutton stared at her, and in his eyes she saw the exact moment he realized he might actually lose this. His pride wouldn't let him back down, but his practical sense had to be calculating the cost. He was spending real money now, serious money, on a horse he didn't particularly want, just to beat a woman he'd already tried to destroy through legal manipulation. 230, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Maebry had exactly $230. Sutton had just matched everything she owned. If she went higher, she'd be bluffing, betting that he wouldn't call her on it. If he did call, if he bid higher, and she couldn't match, she'd be humiliated. Worse, she'd have shown all her cards for nothing. But as she stood there, weighing the risk, she realized something. Sutton didn't know she was at her limit. He'd seen her bid confidently up to this point. For all he knew, she had more in reserve. And his face showed doubt now, showed the strain of spending more than he'd ever intended on what was supposed to be a simple seizure and resale. Maebry took a breath and made her choice. 240, she said clearly. It was a bluff, the biggest gamble of her life. If Sutton called it, she'd lose everything, her money, her dignity, her horse, and any hope of fighting back against the system that had targeted her. But she'd read his face, seen the doubt, and she was betting everything that Byron Sutton, for all his schemes and manipulation, wouldn't risk $250 of his own money just to punish a mountain woman. The silence stretched. Sutton stood frozen, clearly warring with himself. Greaves waited, not daring to speak. The crowd barely breathed. Finally, Sutton turned on his heel and walked away from the platform, his shoulders rigid with fury. Greaves cleared his throat. Going once for $240. Going twice. He looked at Maebry, at the money still on the table. Sold to the lady for $240. The crowd erupted in shocked conversation, but Maebry barely heard it. She'd won. Against all odds, against power and corruption and a system designed to crush people like her, she'd won. She just had to figure out how to actually pay for it. Maebry approached the auction table, her mind racing. She had $230. She'd bid $240. The difference was $10 she didn't have and couldn't produce. Hamilton Greaves was already reaching for the money on the table, ready to count out the payment. "Hold on," Maebry said, and her voice sounded steadier than she felt. She needed a moment to think, to figure a way out of this corner she'd backed herself into. Greaves looked up, suspicious. "Problem." Before Maebry could answer, a hand settled gently on her shoulder. She turned to find an elderly gentleman standing beside her, someone she didn't recognize. He was well dressed in a style that suggested money, but not flash, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Forgive the interruption," the man said, addressing both Maebry and Greaves. "My name is Warren Hayes. I'm a retired judge from Denver, visiting Saddle's End on personal business." He pulled a leather wallet from his coat. "I'd like to contribute $10 toward this lady's purchase, if she'll accept it." Maebry stared at him, speechless. The stranger smiled at her confusion. "You don't know me, Mrs. Holt, but I knew your husband. Joseph saved my life 23 years ago at the Copper Ridge mine. I've never forgotten that debt." The words hit Maebry like a physical blow. She'd known Joseph had helped people over his years in the mines. He'd mentioned it sometimes in passing, but she'd had no idea about anything like this. Hayes continued, speaking now to the crowd as much as to her. "I was a young lawyer back then, traveling through the mining territories, and I'd gone down into Copper Ridge to see the operation firsthand. Foolish of me. There was a collapse in one of the shafts. I was trapped, pinned under timbers, and the dust was so thick I couldn't breathe. Joseph Holt went back into that shaft when everyone else was running out. He dug me free with his bare hands and carried me to safety." Hayes's voice grew thick with emotion. He risked his life for a stranger, asked nothing in return. By the time I recovered enough to thank him properly, he'd moved on to another job. He turned to Maebry, and she saw genuine warmth in his expression. "I've looked for him over the years, hoping to repay the debt. I learned of his death, and I'm sorry for your loss. He was a remarkable man." He held out a $10 bill. "This is a small gesture, but please, allow me to help you bring your horse home." I think Joseph would have approved. Maebry's throat felt tight. She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence, her pride. But she looked at this kind stranger who'd known Joseph, who carried a debt from decades past, and she understood something important. Accepting help wasn't weakness. It was honoring the connections Joseph had made, the good he'd done in the world. "Thank you," she managed. "That's generous, and I accept it." Hayes placed the bill on the table with her money. Greaves counted it all out, his expression sour. The total came to $240 exactly. He wrote out a receipt and stamped it with unnecessary force. "Horse is yours," he said curtly. "Take him and go." Deputy Marsh appeared with Rue's lead rope, having fetched the horse from the pen. When Rue saw Maebry, he nickered and pushed his nose against her chest, nearly knocking her backward. She wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the solid warmth of him, breathing in his familiar scent. "It's all right now," she whispered. "We're going home." The crowd was still talking, still processing what they'd witnessed. Byron Sutton stood at the edge of the gathering, watching with barely contained fury. When his eyes met Maebry's, the hatred in them was unmistakable. This wasn't over for him. She'd humiliated him publicly, cost him money, and exposed his assumption that he could take what he wanted without consequence. Men like Sutton didn't forget that kind of defeat. But right now, Maebry didn't care. She had Rue back. That was what mattered. Warren Hayes walked with her as she led Rue away from the auction yard. "I'm staying at the hotel if you need anything," he said. "And Mrs. Holt, there's something else you should know. I've been following the situation with your land claim. Byron Sutton's activities have reached my attention through legal channels. The man is running a sophisticated scheme, and you're not his only victim." Maebry slowed, looking at him. "I'm not interested in fighting him through courts and lawyers. I just wanted my horse back." "I understand that," Hayes said gently. "But others might want to fight. Others who don't have your strength or resources. If you were willing to share your experience, it might help build a case." "I don't testify," Maebry said flatly. "Don't trust the legal system any further than I can throw it." Hayes nodded, unsurprised. "Joseph mentioned you were independent-minded. He was proud of that." He handed her a small card with an address in Denver. "If you change your mind, or if you just want to talk about Joseph, I'm easy to find. No pressure either way." Maebry took the card, tucked it into her coat. "Appreciate what you did today. For the money, and for the kind words about Joseph." "He deserved them," Hayes said simply. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Holt, And that fine horse." As Hayes walked away, Deputy Marsh approached. "That was quite a show," he said, though his tone was respectful rather than mocking. "Sutton's not going to forget this. You should be careful on your way back up the mountain." "I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Deputy." "I know you have." Marsh hesitated, then said, "I've been keeping records of the land seizures, the patterns I've noticed. If you ever want to see them, or if you know others who might, you know where to find me." Maebry studied him, this young man trying to do right in a system that discouraged it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm tired of watching people get robbed legal," Marsh said, "and because I think you might be the kind of person who could actually do something about it if you wanted to." Before Maebry could respond, a woman's voice called out, "Mrs. Holt, wait, please." An older woman hurried toward them, her dress neat but worn, her face lined with worry and work. "My name's Pauline Hobson. I'm the one who questioned where your money came from. I want to apologize for that. It wasn't fair and it wasn't kind." Maebry recognized her now, the voice that had challenged her legitimacy during the bidding. "You were just asking questions." "No," Pauline said firmly. "I was being cruel, and I knew it. The truth is, my husband and I lost our property to Byron Sutton 3 months ago. He found some technicality with our deed, just like he did with yours. We couldn't afford to fight it in court. Lost the land my husband's father homesteaded, lost everything." Her voice cracked. "When I saw you standing up to him, bidding like you had every right to be there, I felt ashamed. Because we didn't fight. We just gave up and walked away." Maebry felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you really going to let him get away with it?" Pauline asked. "With what he did to you?" "I got my horse back. That's what I came for." "But your land," Pauline pressed. "He took your land. Are you just going to let that stand?" Maebry hadn't thought much beyond getting Rue. The land was still in dispute, still technically seized. She'd focused on the immediate fight, the tangible goal of the horse she could see and touch. The larger battle, the legal complexities, the courtrooms and paperwork, that all felt overwhelming and futile. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm one person. What can I do against lawyers and land agents?" "You just faced down Byron Sutton in front of half the town," Pauline said. "You called his bluff and won. Maybe you can do more than you think." Deputy Marsh cleared his throat. "There's at least 7 families I know of who've lost property to Sutton's schemes in the past 3 years. If they all told their stories together, if there was coordination—" "That's not my fight," Maebry said, more sharply than she intended. "I live alone up on that mountain because I don't want to be part of town politics and community organizing. I'm not a leader. I'm not interested in campaigns or causes." "You might not have a choice," Marsh said quietly. "Sutton's not going to let this go. You embarrassed him today. He'll come after you another way." Maebry felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders. The auction had been one battle, but the war wasn't over. Sutton still had power, still had connections. He could make her life difficult in ways she hadn't even considered. But she was tired. Bone tired from the stress of the day, from the emotional strain of the bidding war, from years of fighting to maintain her independence against a world that seemed determined to complicate simple living. "I need to think," she said. "I need to get Rue home and settled. Then I'll figure out what comes next." Marsh nodded. "Fair enough. You know where to find me if you need help." As Maebry led Rue out of Saddle's End, she could feel eyes on her back. Some curious, some supportive, some hostile. Word of what had happened would spread through the town like wildfire. By tomorrow, Everyone within 50 miles would know the story of the mountain woman who'd outbid Byron Sutton. She'd wanted to slip in quietly, get her horse, and leave. Instead, she'd become the center of something much larger than herself. And whether she wanted it or not, her actions had made her a symbol of resistance, of refusal to be dismissed, of the possibility that power could be challenged. The question was what she would do with that role. For now, though, she just wanted to go home. The journey back up the mountain should have been triumphant. Maebry had Rue back, had faced down her enemies, had proven she couldn't be dismissed or ignored. But as she climbed the familiar trail, leading her horse by the rope Deputy Marsh had given her, she felt more unsettled than relieved. The money was gone, nearly all of it. She had maybe $20 left from what she'd brought, enough for basic supplies, but nothing close to the security she'd had before. One hard winter, one serious injury, one unexpected crisis, and she'd have nothing to fall back on. The thought sat heavy in her chest. Rue seemed happy to be heading home, his steps lively despite the long day. He recognized the trail, knew where they were going. Watching him, Maebry felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. She'd made the right choice, regardless of the cost. Some things mattered more than money. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and purple. Maebry got Rue settled in his shelter with fresh water and the grain she'd left stored in a sealed tin. He ate contentedly while she stood in the doorway, watching him, still hardly believing he was really back. Inside the cabin, everything was exactly as she'd left it. The empty feeling she'd carried since the seizure was gone now, replaced by the comfortable solitude she'd always known. She built a fire, made a simple meal, and tried not to think about the complications she'd left behind in Saddle's End. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Byron Sutton's face, saw the calculation and hatred in his expression. Deputy Marsh's warning echoed in her mind. Sutton's not going to let this go. He'll come after you another way. What other way? What could he do now? He'd already seized her land, already taken everything official and legal. She'd gotten Rue back through legitimate means, with witnessed payment at a public auction. There was nothing improper about what she'd done, except that men like Sutton didn't need impropriety to cause trouble. They knew how to manipulate systems, how to find angles and loopholes. Maebry had lived outside those systems for so long, she'd forgotten how vulnerable that made her to those who understood them. 3 days passed in relative peace. Maebry fell back into her routines, tending her small garden, checking her trap lines, repairing the fence around Rue's grazing area that had sagged in her absence. The physical work felt good, grounding. This was the life she knew, the life that made sense. On the 4th day, Deputy Marsh rode up to her cabin. Maebry saw him coming from a distance and felt her stomach clench. Official visits were never good news. She met him on her porch, arms crossed, waiting. Marsh dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Holt, I'm afraid I have some papers for you." "More papers?" Maebry's voice was flat. "Haven't you people taken enough?" "These aren't from me," Marsh said quickly. "They're from Byron Sutton. He's filed a legal challenge to the auction results. Claims there were irregularities in the bidding process." Maebry took the papers he offered, scanned them without fully understanding the legal language. "What kind of irregularities?" "He's claiming that Warren Hayes's contribution constituted an illegal partnership or collusion of some kind. Says the auction should be invalidated, the sale reversed." Marsh shook his head. "It's nonsense, legally speaking. Hayes made a gift to you. You used your own funds to bid. But Sutton's got lawyers, and they can make nonsense sound official enough to require a court response. So what does this mean? It means you have 30 days to respond to the filing. Means you might need to appear in court to defend the purchase. Means Sutton's trying to wear you down with legal fees and complications until you just give up. Maebry felt something cold settle in her chest. This was exactly what she'd feared, what she'd tried to avoid by staying out of the legal system entirely. Now she was being dragged into it anyway, forced to fight on ground where she had no experience and no resources. "I can't afford a lawyer," she said, quietly. "I know." Marsh hesitated. "But I talked to Warren Hayes before I came up here. He's still in town and he's offering to represent you." "Pro bono," he said. "No charge." "Why would he do that?" "He says he owes your husband a debt that $10 doesn't begin to cover, and he says he's interested in seeing Sutton's schemes exposed in a legal setting." Marsh pulled another card from his pocket. "He asked me to give you this. It's the address of his hotel room. He'll be in town another week." Maebry took the card, stared at it. Accepting Hayes's money had been one thing, a simple gift to complete a transaction. But accepting legal representation, allowing him to fight her battles, that felt different. That felt like admitting she couldn't handle her own affairs. "I need to think about it," she said. Marsh nodded. "He said you'd say that. But Mrs. Holt, you should know. There's been a meeting in town. Pauline Hobson, the woman who apologized to you after the auction. She's been talking to other families who lost property to Sutton. They're organizing, comparing stories, and they're angry. What you did, standing up to him like that, it woke something up in people." "That wasn't my intention." "Maybe not, but it happened anyway." Marsh met her eyes. "You started something, whether you meant to or not. And there are people down there who'd follow your lead if you gave them one." "I'm not a leader," Maebry said, echoing what she'd told him before. "I'm a woman who lives alone on a mountain. That's all I want to be. Sometimes what we want and what we're needed for don't line up," Marsh said gently. "I'll leave you to think on it. But think fast. 30 days isn't much time, and Sutton's lawyers work quick." After he left, Maebry sat on her porch for a long time, watching the sun track across the sky. Rue grazed peacefully in his area, unconcerned with legal challenges and community organizing. She envied him that simplicity. She thought about Joseph, about what he would have done in this situation. He'd been a good man, a strong man, but not a fighter in the legal sense. He'd avoided complications, same as her. Worked hard, kept to himself, didn't make waves. But he'd also gone back into a collapsing mine shaft to save a stranger. He'd risked everything on principle, on the simple belief that you helped people when they needed it, consequences be damned. What would he think of her now, sitting here debating whether to fight? The question didn't have an easy answer. Joseph had been brave in moments of crisis, but he'd also been practical about long-term survival. Fighting Sutton could cost her more than money. It could cost her peace, her privacy, maybe even her safety. But letting Sutton win meant accepting that power and corruption would always triumph. It meant all those other families would continue losing their land. It meant the system would keep grinding people down because no one was willing to stand in front of it and say no. Maebry went inside and found the cards both Marsh and Hayes had given her. She laid them on her table, stared at them for what felt like hours. 2 paths forward. One led back to the life she knew, isolated, simple, safe. The other led into complications she could barely imagine. As the sun set and darkness filled her cabin, Maebry made her decision. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she packed a small bag, checked on Rue one last time, and prepared for the journey back down to Saddle's End. In the morning, she would find Warren Hayes and tell him she accepted his help, not because she wanted to be a symbol or a leader, but because sometimes fighting back was the only way to maintain dignity. And dignity, she'd learned from Joseph, was worth more than comfort. The walk down the mountain felt different this time. She wasn't going to retrieve something taken from her. She was going to fight for something bigger than herself, whether she wanted to or not. By the time she reached Saddle's End, word had already spread that she was coming back. A small group waited at the edge of town. Pauline Hobson, Deputy Marsh, a few others she didn't recognize. They looked at her with something like hope, and Maebry felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders. She wasn't a leader. She wasn't a crusader. She was just a woman who'd been pushed too far and decided to push back. But maybe, she thought, that was enough. Warren Hayes's hotel room was nicer than anywhere Maebry had ever stayed. The furniture was polished wood, the bed had actual springs, and there was a writing desk with proper paper and ink. Hayes sat at that desk now, papers spread before him, his spectacles perched on his nose as he reviewed documents. "Mrs. Holt," he said warmly when she entered. "I'm glad you came. Please, sit." Maebry took the offered chair, feeling out of place among the refinement. "Deputy Marsh said you were willing to help with the legal challenge." "More than willing. I've been reviewing Sutton's filing, and it's exactly what I expected. A nuisance suit designed to intimidate rather than adjudicate. The legal basis is thin at best." Hayes tapped the papers. "But that doesn't mean we can ignore it. Courts move slowly and favor those who understand procedure. We need to file a proper response." "I don't understand legal procedure," Maebry admitted. "Never had cause to learn it." "That's why I'm here." Hayes pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "I need you to tell me everything about your land claim, when your husband purchased it, where the deed was filed, what documentation you have. Start from the beginning." For the next hour, Maebry recounted the history. How Joseph had found the property, how they'd saved to buy it, how the original deed had been filed in the county office where they'd been told to file it. She described the letters from Sutton, her refusal to respond, the seizure of her land, and Rue. Hayes took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When she finished, he sat back and studied his notes with a thoughtful expression. "The core of your case is strong," he said finally. "You have legitimate ownership, properly documented. The fact that the deed was filed in a different county office is irrelevant. It's still legal filing. Sutton exploited a technicality, but the underlying ownership is clear. So why did they get away with seizing my land?" "Because you didn't contest it," Hayes said gently. "In law, silence can be interpreted as acquiescence. When you didn't respond to the notices, didn't appear at the hearings, the court ruled by default. But that ruling can be challenged, especially now that you are willing to engage." "What about the auction challenge? Can Sutton really reverse the sale?" "No," Hayes said firmly. "The auction was conducted properly. My contribution to you was a personal gift, perfectly legal. Sutton's argument relies on claiming we colluded beforehand, which we didn't. He has no evidence because there's no evidence. This is pure harassment, trying to exhaust your resources and will to fight." There was a knock at the door. Hayes called, "Come in," and Deputy Marsh entered, followed by Pauline Hobson and two other people Maebry didn't recognize, a middle-aged man with work-worn hands and a younger woman who looked nervous. "Apologize for the interruption," Marsh said, "but these folks heard Mrs. Holt was meeting with you, and they wanted to share their stories too." Hayes gestured to the available chairs and the bed. Please, sit. I'm happy to hear from anyone affected by these land schemes. The middle-aged man spoke first. Name's Tom Brenner. I lost 40 acres to Sutton 2 years back. Same story. He claimed my grandfather's original homestead filing had irregularities. Took it to court, and I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight it. Lost the farm my family worked for 3 generations. The younger woman was next. I'm Sophie Caldwell. Sutton took my mother's property 6 months after she died. Said the inheritance transfer wasn't properly documented. We had the will, had everything legal, but he tied it up in court until we ran out of money for lawyers. Ended up settling for pennies on the dollar. Pauline added her story again, this time with more details. How Sutton had approached them friendly at first, offering to help clarify their title. How the clarification had turned into a dispute, the dispute into a seizure. How they'd been too ashamed and exhausted to fight. Hayes listened to each story, taking careful notes. When they finished, he looked around the room with a grim expression. This is a pattern of fraud, systematic, deliberate, and likely criminal. The question is whether we can prove it in a way that courts will recognize. I've been keeping records, Marsh said. He produced a notebook from his coat. Every land seizure I've noticed, every auction I've found suspicious. It's not official evidence, but it shows the pattern. Hayes took the notebook, flipped through it. His expression grew darker with each page. This is more extensive than I realized. Sutton's been running this scheme for years, probably longer than the 2 years since he came to Saddle's End. He's done this before, elsewhere. Men like him move from town to town, exploiting areas with unclear land titles and weak legal oversight. Can you stop him? Tom Brenner asked, and his voice carried desperate hope. I can try, Hayes said carefully. But I need to be honest with you all. Fighting this properly means going through the courts, which is slow and expensive. Even pro bono representation requires filing fees, court costs, documentation expenses. And Sutton has money for lawyers who'll drag everything out as long as possible. The room fell silent. Maebry could see the defeat settling over the others, the weight of knowing that justice existed in theory, but was often out of reach for ordinary people. How much are we talking about? She asked. For the filing fees and such, Hayes calculated quickly. For all the cases represented here, probably $200 minimum. Maybe more, depending on how Sutton's lawyers respond. $200. Maebry almost laughed at the bitter irony. She'd just spent nearly everything she had to buy back her own horse. She didn't have $200. None of them did. That was the whole problem. What if we went public? Marsh suggested. Newspapers, maybe. Get the story out about what Sutton's been doing? Media attention could help, Hayes admitted, but it could also backfire. Sutton could sue for defamation, claim we're damaging his reputation. Without ironclad proof, we'd be vulnerable. So we're back to needing money for a proper legal fight, Pauline said flatly. The meeting ended without clear resolution, everyone agreeing to think about options, and reconvened the next day. As the others filed out, Maebry lingered. Hayes looked at her questioningly. This debt you feel you owe Joseph, she said slowly. How far does it extend? As far as it needs to, Hayes replied without hesitation. Why? Because I'm wondering if it extends to investigating Byron Sutton's background, where he came from, whether he's done this before in other towns. If we could prove he's a professional fraud artist, would that help the legal case? Hayes considered this, then nodded slowly. Yes, actually. A pattern of similar behavior in other jurisdictions would be highly relevant. It could elevate this from individual property disputes to systematic fraud, which carries criminal penalties. He paused. But that kind of investigation takes time and resources. I'd need to send telegrams, contact colleagues in other counties, search records. How much time? A week, maybe 2 if I'm thorough. Maebry made a decision. Do it. Whatever it costs, I'll find a way to pay you back. Mrs. Holt, you don't have— I know what I don't have, Maebry interrupted. But I also know this is bigger than me now. Those people who just left, they need someone to fight for them. And like it or not, I seem to be that someone. She met his eyes. Joseph saved your life. Maybe you can save all of ours by stopping Sutton before he destroys anyone else. Hayes studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. It would be my honor to help. And Mrs. Holt, for what it's worth, I think Joseph would be very proud of who you've become. They shook hands, sealing an agreement that would change everything. Maebry left the hotel feeling both lighter and heavier than before. Lighter because she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Heavier because she'd just committed herself to a battle that could consume months or years of her life. On her way through town, she stopped at the general store to pick up basic supplies before heading back up the mountain. The shopkeeper, an older man named George, gave her an odd look. "Heard what you did at the auction," he said, as he tallied her purchases. "Took some brass, standing up to Sutton like that. Just wanted my horse back. Maybe so, but folks are talking, saying maybe it's time someone challenged how things work around here." He leaned in closer. "My brother lost his place to Sutton last year. If there's a fight coming, tell him I'll contribute what I can." Maebry blinked in surprise. "That's generous." "Not generous. Smart." George bagged her supplies. "Sutton's like a disease. You don't cure a disease by ignoring it. You cut it out before it spreads." Similar conversations happened twice more before Maebry left town. A carpenter who'd lost tools to a suspicious lien. A widow whose property boundary had mysteriously shifted after Sutton helped survey it. Each offered support, whether money or testimony or simply encouragement. By the time Maebry started back up the mountain, she understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. She wasn't alone in this fight. The community was ready to push back. They'd just been waiting for someone to push first. She'd become that someone without meaning to, simply by refusing to disappear quietly when powerful people wanted her gone. The question now was whether being that someone would be enough to actually win. 10 days after Maebry's meeting with Warren Hayes, a telegram arrived at Deputy Marsh's office. He rode up to her cabin immediately, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Mrs. Holt," he called out as he dismounted. "Hayes sent this. You need to read it." Maebry took the telegram, her hands suddenly unsteady. The message was brief but explosive. "Sutton real name, Byron Peterson, stop wanted. 3 counties. Fraud embezzlement. Stop property scheme, identical Nevada territory. 1881. Stop fled before trial. Stop warrant still active. Stop documentation follows. Stop Hayes." Maebry read it twice, then looked at Marsh. "He's a wanted criminal?" "Has been for over a decade, apparently." Marsh was grinning. Hayes tracked him through court records and old newspaper archives. Sutton, or Peterson, ran the exact same scheme in Nevada. Seized properties through legal technicalities, sold them at auction to his partners, split the profits. Got caught when a lawyer started connecting the dots, but he disappeared before trial. So all of this, everything he's done here, was never legal to begin with, Marsh finished. If Sutton's real identity is Byron Peterson, and if he's been operating under a false name to evade arrest, then every transaction he's been involved with could be invalidated. Every property seizure, every sale, everything. Maebry felt her heart pounding. This was bigger than she'd imagined. Not just wrong, not just corrupt, but criminal in ways that could actually be prosecuted. What happens now? Hayes is on his way back here with the documentation. Sheriff's going to have to act once he sees a valid warrant from another jurisdiction. We can arrest Sutton, hold him for extradition. Marsh's expression turned serious. But you should know, this is going to get dangerous. Once Sutton realizes we know who he really is, he might run. Or he might fight. Men with this much to lose don't always go quietly. You think he'd hurt someone? I think he's desperate, and desperate men are unpredictable. Marsh shifted his weight. I'm posting a deputy at the town hall, where Hayes is going to present the evidence. And I'd feel better if you stayed in town for a few days, somewhere public where Sutton can't get to you alone. Maebry bristled at the suggestion. I can take care of myself. I know you can. But Sutton knows where you live, knows you're isolated up here. If he decides to retaliate before we can arrest him. Marsh let the sentence hang. The thought of Sutton coming to her cabin, threatening Rue, or burning her property, made Maebry's stomach turn. She'd stood up to him in public, humiliated him at the auction. If he realized his entire scheme was about to collapse, what would he do to the woman who'd started the unraveling? I'll come to town, she said reluctantly. But I'm bringing Rue. I'm not leaving him alone up here either. 3 days later, Warren Hayes returned to Saddle's End with a leather satchel full of documents. He'd done more than just find Sutton's real identity. He'd built a comprehensive case showing the pattern of fraud across multiple territories. Property seizures in Nevada, suspicious land transfers in Colorado, forced auctions in Wyoming. The same scheme, the same techniques, the same outcome. Displaced families and a man named Byron Peterson getting wealthy from other people's loss. The meeting was held in the town hall, and nearly half of Saddle's End showed up. Word had spread that something significant was happening, that the mysterious investigation into Sutton's activities had borne fruit. Maebry sat in the front row, Pauline Hobson beside her, with Tom Brenner and Sophie Caldwell, and dozens of others filling the benches behind them. Hayes stood at the front of the room, his documents organized on a table. The sheriff, an older man named Bill Crawford, who'd mostly avoided controversy during his tenure, sat to one side, looking deeply uncomfortable. Deputy Marsh stood at the door, hand resting near his pistol. Thank you all for coming, Hayes began. I'm going to present evidence that Byron Sutton, the land agent who's been operating in Saddle's End for the past 7 years, is actually Byron Peterson, a fugitive wanted for fraud and embezzlement in Nevada territory. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Hayes laid out the case methodically, showing court documents from Nevada, wanted posters with a younger Sutton's face clearly visible, newspaper clippings describing his scheme and subsequent flight from justice. With each piece of evidence, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, angrier. Furthermore, Hayes continued, I've documented at least 15 property seizures in this county that follow the exact pattern Peterson used in Nevada. False claims of documentation, irregularities, manufactured legal disputes, forced auctions where Peterson's associates bought properties at below-market prices. The estimated loss to families in this community exceeds $10,000. $10,000. The number was staggering. That represented years of work, entire family legacies, security that people had built over generations. Sheriff Crawford stood up, clearing his throat. Now hold on, Judge Hayes. These are serious accusations. Are you certain about this identification? Absolutely certain. Hayes pulled out a wanted poster and a recent photograph of Sutton side by side. Even accounting for 15 years of aging, the resemblance was unmistakable. Same narrow face, Same calculating eyes, same distinctive scar above the left eyebrow. "Where is Sutton now?" someone called from the crowd. Marsh spoke up. "We don't know. I went to his office this morning to bring him in for questioning, and he was gone. His landlord said he left last night with all his belongings, paid his rent through the month, and disappeared." The room erupted in angry shouts. People wanted to know how Sutton could have been warned, who tipped him off, why the sheriff hadn't acted sooner. Crawford tried to restore order, his face red with frustration and embarrassment. Hayes raised his hands for quiet. "Everyone, please. I understand the anger, but we need to focus on what comes next. Sheriff Crawford, I'm formally requesting that you issue a warrant for Byron Peterson's arrest and notify surrounding counties to be on watch for him." Crawford nodded reluctantly. "I'll send the telegrams today." "What about our properties?" Tom Brenner demanded. "If all his seizures were illegal, do we get our land back?" "That's more complicated," Hayes admitted. "If the seizures were conducted by a fugitive operating under false identity, they can be challenged in court. But the legal process takes time. We'll need to file petitions, prove each individual case, work through the system." "We don't have time," Sophie Caldwell said, her voice breaking. "Some of us have been homeless for months. We can't afford to wait for courts and lawyers." Maebry stood up, surprising herself as much as anyone. "Then we don't wait. We take back what's ours." The room went silent. Hayes looked at her with alarm. "Mrs. Holt, I can't advise—" "I'm not asking for advice," Maebry said firmly. "I'm saying if the law won't help us fast enough, we help ourselves. My land was stolen from me through fraud. Tom's land, Sophie's land, Pauline's land, all stolen. If Sutton's gone, and his claims were never legal to begin with, what's stopping us from going back to our properties?" "The law," Crawford said stiffly. "You can't just occupy land because you think you have a claim to it." "Why not?" Maebry challenged. "Sutton did exactly that, and you let him. He occupied our land through fake paperwork and corrupt auctions, and now he's run off like the coward he is. We're not criminals. We're the rightful owners, taking back what was always ours." Marsh looked torn. "Mrs. Holt, as a deputy, I can't support vigilante action." "Then look the other way," Maebry said bluntly, "because we're doing this whether you support it or not." The crowd was murmuring now, some in agreement, some uncertain. Hayes tried again to interject legal caution, but Maebry could see the shift happening in the room. People were tired of waiting, tired of being victimized, tired of watching the system protect their abuser while offering them nothing but delays and excuses. Pauline stood up beside Maebry. "I'm with her. My husband and I are going back to our farm tomorrow. Anyone tries to stop us, they can explain to a judge why we don't belong on land we paid for and worked for 30 years. Tom Brenner rose. "Same here. I'm reclaiming my property." Sophie Caldwell joined them, then others, until half the room was standing. It wasn't a mob or a riot. It was something more powerful. It was a community deciding collectively that enough was enough, that justice delayed was justice denied, and that sometimes people had to take matters into their own hands. Hayes looked at Maebry with something between admiration and concern. "You understand this could lead to arrests, to more legal trouble?" "I've been in legal trouble since Sutton showed up," Maebry replied. "At least this way I'm fighting back instead of just enduring it." Crawford sputtered protests about property law and due process, but his voice was lost in the groundswell of determination. Marsh caught Maebry's eye and gave her a small nod, not approval exactly, but understanding. The meeting broke up with people making plans, coordinating who would reclaim what property and when. Hayes pulled Maebry aside as the crowd dispersed. "This is a risk. he said quietly. A big one. Everything worth doing is a risk, Maebry replied. Joseph taught me that when he went back into that mine for you. Hayes smiled sadly. He did indeed. Very well. I'll do what I can to provide legal cover. File the proper motions to support your actions after the fact. But Maebry, be careful. Sutton may be gone, but he had partners, people who profited from his schemes. They won't give up their stolen property easily. Then they'll have to take it from us twice, Maebry said. And this time, we're not going quietly. As she left the town hall, Maebry felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope mixed with purpose. She'd come to Saddle's End just wanting her horse back. Now she was leading a movement to reclaim an entire community's stolen heritage. She didn't know if it would work, didn't know if the law would eventually support them or crush them. But she knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. Joseph would have understood that, would have approved, she thought. Tomorrow, she'd go back up to her mountain and plant her flag on land that had always been hers. Let anyone try to remove her. The movement back to reclaimed properties happened quickly, almost too quickly for authorities to respond, even if they'd wanted to. Within 2 days of the town hall meeting, 15 families had returned to lands they'd lost to Byron Sutton's schemes. They arrived with wagons, tools, and a determination that surprised even themselves. Maebry went back to her mountain cabin with Rue, half expecting to find it burned or vandalized. Instead, everything was exactly as she'd left it. The cabin stood solid. The garden showed new growth from recent rains, and the mountains stretched unchanged around her. This was her land, always had been. She spent the first day simply reclaiming the space, walking the property boundaries, checking the creek that provided her water, inspecting the small clearing where she'd buried Joseph all those years ago. Standing at his grave, she told him about everything that had happened, about the fight she'd started, about the community that had rallied around her cause. "Hope you don't mind," she said to the simple wooden cross. "I know you liked things quiet, but sometimes quiet isn't possible anymore." The wind through the pines was her only answer, but it felt like approval. Down in Saddle's End, however, things were far from quiet. Hamilton Greaves, the auctioneer who'd profited from Sutton's scheme, had been arrested on charges of conspiracy to defraud. He'd tried to flee like his partner, but hadn't moved fast enough. Deputy Marsh had brought him in, and under questioning, Greaves had started talking, desperate to reduce his own culpability. What he revealed was worse than anyone had suspected. Sutton, Peterson, had partners across 3 territories. The land fraud operation was coordinated, with agents in different towns identifying properties with unclear titles, manufactured disputes being created simultaneously, and a network of buyers who'd purchase seized properties at auction and then flip them for profit. The scheme had operated for over a decade, stealing an estimated $50,000 in property value across the region. Warren Hayes worked around the clock filing legal motions based on Greaves's testimony. He argued that every transaction conducted under Sutton's false identity was void, that properties should revert to their original owners immediately, that the families who'd reclaimed their land were legally justified in doing so. The territorial courts were less certain. This kind of mass property reversal had no real precedent. Judges worried about setting dangerous precedents, about the chaos that might result from invalidating hundreds of transactions. There were calls for calm, for patience, for everyone to wait while the legal system worked through the complexities. But the families who'd lost everything weren't interested in patience. They were living on their reclaimed land, working it, defending it. And they were organizing. Maebry found herself at the center of this organization, without seeking it. People came to her cabin for advice, for leadership, for reassurance that they were doing the right thing. Pauline Hobson made the trek up the mountain at least twice a week, bringing news from town and asking Maebry's opinion on various strategies. "There's talk of forming a committee," Pauline said during one visit, sitting on Maebry's porch with a tin cup of coffee. "Something official to represent all the families who've reclaimed property. They want you to chair it." Maebry shook her head. "I'm not a politician. No, you're better. You're someone who actually did something instead of just talking about it." Pauline set down her cup. "People trust you, Maebry. You stood up to Sutton when the rest of us were too scared. You started this whole thing. Now we need someone to see it through." "What does seeing it through even mean?" "It means making sure we don't lose our land again. Means coordinating our legal defense if the courts try to force us off. Means standing together so they can't pick us off one by one." Pauline met her eyes. "We're stronger together. But we need leadership. You're the strongest person I know. Please." Maebry was quiet for a long time, watching Rue graze in the distance. Leadership meant responsibility, meant being accountable not just for herself, but for others. Meant stepping fully into a role she'd never wanted and didn't feel qualified for. But she also remembered standing in that auction yard, raising her hand to bid on Rue, feeling utterly alone against systems designed to crush people like her. If she'd had a community backing her then, maybe it wouldn't have cost her everything she owned. Maybe she wouldn't have needed Warren Hayes' gift to win. These families needed what she'd lacked: solidarity, coordination, someone willing to stand in front when standing was required. "All right," she said finally. "I'll chair the committee, but I'm not moving to town. People want to meet, they come up here." Pauline smiled. "Fair enough. I'll spread the word." The committee formed quickly after that. 15 families, representing over 2,000 acres of reclaimed land. They met at Maebry's cabin because it was neutral ground, and because, frankly, no one wanted to argue with the woman who'd faced down Byron Sutton in public. Their first meeting established basic principles. They would support each other's claims collectively, meaning if authorities tried to remove one family, all 15 would resist. They would pool resources for legal fees and documentation. They would maintain detailed records of their original ownership to present in court, and they would remain peaceful but firm. No violence, but no surrender either. Deputy Marsh attended that meeting in an unofficial capacity. "Sheriff Crawford is under pressure from the territorial governor," he told them. "There are complaints that Saddle's End is harboring squatters and vigilantes. The governor wants order restored, which means he wants you all off the disputed properties until courts settle ownership." "How long will courts take?" Tom Brenner asked. "Could be months. Could be years." "We can't wait years," Sophie Caldwell said. "Some of us have nowhere else to go." Marsh looked sympathetic. "I know, and between us, I think you're in the right. But I'm telling you what's coming. There will be pressure to evict you, possibly by force." "Let them try," someone muttered from the back. Maebry held up a hand for quiet. "No, we agreed. No violence. If they come with force, we respond with law. Warren's filing motions to block any eviction attempts. We trust the legal process to work, even if it's slow." "And if it doesn't work," Tom challenged. "Then we make it work," Maebry said firmly. "We make enough noise that ignoring us becomes harder than helping us. We contact newspapers, territorial representatives, anyone who'll listen. We make our case to the public, not just to judges." Hayes, who'd been quietly observing, spoke up. "That's actually a sound strategy. Public opinion can influence legal outcomes, especially in territorial matters where appointed judges answer to elected officials. If we can show that a community of hard-working families is being victimized by systematic fraud, it becomes politically difficult to side with the fraudsters. "How do we do that?" Pauline asked. "We tell our stories," Maebry said. "All of them. Every family here writes down what happened, how they lost their property, what it meant to their lives. We collect those stories and send them to newspapers, to the territorial capital, to anyone who might care." The meeting continued for hours, planning and organizing. By the time people left, they had a strategy, a timeline, and a shared sense of purpose. Maebry felt exhausted, but also energized. This was work that mattered, work that could actually change things. Over the next week, the stories came together. Tom Brenner wrote about his grandfather homesteading the land in the 1850s, about 3 generations working the same soil. Sophie Caldwell described her mother's dying wish that the family property stay in family hands, a wish Sutton had stolen. Pauline Hobson detailed 30 years of marriage and partnership, building a small farm from nothing, only to lose it to paperwork manipulation. Maebry wrote her own story, though it came harder than she expected, putting Joseph's memory into words, describing their life together, explaining what the mountain cabin meant beyond simple property value. It forced her to confront emotions she'd kept buried for years. When she finished, she had 10 pages of careful handwriting, describing not just what had been taken from her, but why it mattered. Why land wasn't just dirt and timber, but identity, history, and connection to something larger than individual existence. Hayes compiled all the stories into a formal document, added the legal evidence of Sutton's fraud, and sent copies to every newspaper in the territory. He also sent copies to the territorial governor, to the attorney general, to anyone with influence or authority. The response started slowly, then built like an avalanche. A newspaper in Denver ran the story on the front page. "Fraud ring displaces dozens of families. Land agent wanted for decade-old crimes." Other papers picked it up. Within 2 weeks, the story of Saddle's End's land fraud scheme was territorial news. Letters of support began arriving. A lawyer in Colorado offered pro bono assistance. A citizens group in Wyoming sent a donation to help with legal fees. A territorial representative publicly called for investigation and restitution. The pressure was working. The governor's office, which had initially sided with order and process, began backing away from hard eviction talk. No one wanted to be seen forcing hard-working families off legitimately owned land to protect a fugitive criminal's illegal transactions. But victory wasn't guaranteed yet. There were still judges who worried about precedent, still officials who preferred slow, careful process over fast justice, still complications and legal tangles that could drag on for years. And there was still the matter of Byron Sutton himself, who remained at large and might return to cause trouble if he thought he could win. Deputy Marsh brought that news to Maebry's cabin on a cold morning 3 weeks after the committee formed. "We got word from a marshal in Wyoming. Someone matching Sutton's description was spotted in a town near the border. He's not far, and he might be planning something." "Like what?" Maebry asked. "Don't know. But men like him don't just disappear. They scheme, they plan revenge. You humiliated him publicly, cost him his operation. He's got reason to hold a grudge." Maebry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd been so focused on the legal battle, on organizing the community, that she'd almost forgotten Sutton was a real person with agency and anger. "You think he'd come back here?" "I think he's arrogant enough to try something," Marsh said. "Keep your rifle close, and maybe don't stay up here alone until we know where he is." But Maebry had no intention of leaving her cabin, not for Sutton or anyone else. This was her land, won back through courage and community support. She wouldn't be driven off by threats from a coward who operated through manipulation and fraud. "I'll be careful," she promised Marsh, "but I'm not hiding." After he left, though, Maebry did check her rifle, made sure it was loaded and ready. She also secured Rue's shelter, made sure he couldn't be easily spooked or stolen if someone came around at night. Then she sat on her porch and waited, watching the trail down the mountain, ready for whatever came next. Sutton came on a moonless night, 4 weeks after fleeing Saddle's End. He didn't come alone. Maebry woke to Rue's warning whinny, the sound that meant strangers approaching. She was out of bed instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window. In the darkness, she could make out shapes. 3, maybe 4 men on horseback, moving up the trail toward her cabin. They stopped about 50 yards out, and 1 man dismounted. Even in the dark, Maebry recognized Byron Sutton's silhouette. "Mrs. Holt," he called out, "I think we need to have a conversation." Maebry didn't answer. She checked her rifle again, positioned herself where she could see the men, but had cover from the cabin's thick log walls. "I know you're awake," Sutton continued. "I know you're armed. But I'm not here for violence. I'm here to make you an offer." "Not interested in offers from thieves," Maebry called back. Sutton's laugh was bitter. "Thieves? I'm a businessman, Mrs. Holt. I identified opportunities and capitalized on them. That's what this country was built on. This country was built on honest work, not stealing from people who couldn't afford lawyers." Semantics. Sutton moved closer, his hands visibly empty and raised. The other men stayed mounted, watching. "Here's the reality. You've made a lot of noise, gotten the newspapers involved, created quite the spectacle. Congratulations. But you haven't actually won anything. We got our land back. For now," Sutton said. "But the legal challenges are just beginning. Do you know how many judges owe me favors? How many officials I've helped over the years? This could drag through courts for a decade. You'll die of old age before you get clear title." Maebry kept her rifle steady. "Then I'll die on my own land. Better than living on someone else's." Sutton stopped about 20 feet from the porch, close enough that Maebry could see his face in the starlight. He looked older, harder than at the auction. Hunted. "Or," he said carefully, "you could accept a settlement. I'll sign over clear title to your property and to the other committee members' lands. No more legal challenges, no more complications. You win." "In exchange for what?" "Your silence, and Warren Hayes's files." Sutton's voice hardened. "That judge has been collecting evidence against me across multiple territories. Evidence that could lead to criminal prosecution, even execution if they can prove certain charges. I want those files destroyed, and I want you and your committee to stop cooperating with authorities." Maebry almost laughed. "You think I'd protect you? After what you did?" "I think you'd protect your community," Sutton countered. "Think about it, Mrs. Holt. Accept this offer, and 15 families get their land free and clear immediately. No years of legal battles, no uncertainty. Reject it, and I guarantee I'll tie up every claim in so much litigation you'll need lawyers for lawyers. Some of those families will give up. Some will die waiting for resolution. Is your pride worth their suffering?" It was a clever argument, designed to exploit Maebry's sense of responsibility for the community she'd organized, and it might have worked if she didn't understand what accepting would mean. "If we protect you," she said slowly, "you'll just do this somewhere else. Another town, another group of families who can't fight back. We'd be trading our justice for their destruction." "That's not your problem." "It is now. Maebry raised the rifle slightly, not quite aiming at Sutton, but making the threat clear. You're wanted for crimes in 3 territories. You're a fugitive, and you just admitted to me that you're planning to continue defrauding people. I won't protect that. Sutton's expression went cold. Then you're a fool. You could have ended this tonight, gotten everything you wanted. Instead, you're choosing the hard way. The hard way is the only way that means anything, Maebry replied. My husband taught me that. You take the shortcut, you lose something of yourself. I'm not losing anything else to you. For a long moment, Sutton just stared at her. Then he shook his head slowly. This could have been simple. He turned and walked back to his horse. As he mounted, he called out one last time. You've made an enemy tonight, Mrs. Holt, and I'm not a forgiving man. Good thing I'm not either, Maebry said. The riders turned and headed back down the trail, disappearing into the darkness. Maebry stayed at the window for another hour, rifle ready, making sure they were truly gone. When the first hint of dawn touched the sky, she finally relaxed her grip on the weapon. Sutton had offered her an easy way out, and she'd refused it. That decision would have consequences. The legal battle would continue, possibly for years. Sutton would use every resource and connection he had to make their lives difficult. But Maebry had meant what she said. The hard way was the only way that preserved dignity, that meant something beyond simple survival. Joseph had understood that, had lived it when he went into that collapsing mine shaft for a stranger. She'd honor his memory by doing the same, by fighting for what was right, not what was easy. As the sun rose over the mountains, Maebry made coffee and prepared for the day ahead. She needed to get word to Warren Hayes about Sutton's offer and his implicit admission of ongoing criminal intent. Needed to tell the committee that the fight was far from over. But she also felt a quiet satisfaction. Sutton had come to intimidate her, to buy her off, to make her fold. He'd failed, and in that failure, Maebry found confirmation that she'd chosen correctly. Not just in refusing his offer, but in everything that had led to this moment. Standing up at the auction, organizing the community, reclaiming what was hers. The fight would continue. But she would face it standing, not kneeling. Maebry rode down to Saddle's End at first light, pushing Rue harder than she normally would. Deputy Marsh needed to know about Sutton's return immediately. Warren Hayes needed to secure his files. The committee members needed to be warned. She found Marsh at his office, just starting his morning rounds. When she described the midnight visit and Sutton's offer, his face went pale. He came to your cabin? With armed men? Marsh was already strapping on his gun belt. That's threatening a witness. Conspiracy. About 6 other charges I can think of. If we can catch him, he's long gone by now, Maebry said. But he admitted he's planning to keep operating, keep defrauding people. That's got to be useful to Hayes's case. Marsh nodded grimly. I'll get word to the Marshal Service. And I'm posting a deputy on this end of the mountain trail. Sutton comes back. We'll know about it. Hayes arrived within the hour, summoned by urgent message. He listened to Maebry's account of the confrontation, his expression growing darker with each detail. He offered to trade clear titles for my files and your silence, Hayes said when she finished. That tells me those files are more damaging than I even realized. He's desperate, which makes him dangerous. Can we use his offer against him? Maebry asked. He basically confessed to fraud and to planning more crimes. Your testimony about what he said would be valuable, Hayes confirmed, especially combined with Greaves's cooperation and the documentary evidence. But we'd need Sutton in custody to prosecute, and he's proven elusive. The territorial marshal, a hard-eyed man named Coleman, who'd arrived 2 days earlier, joined the conversation. We've got men watching the border crossings and main roads. Sutton can't run forever. Eventually he'll make a mistake, try to access funds, or contact an associate. When he does, we'll have him." "What about the property claims?" Maebry asked. "Sutton said he'd tie us up in litigation for years." Hayes pulled out a leather folder. "Actually, I have good news on that front. Based on Greaves's testimony and the evidence we've compiled, the Territorial Attorney General has filed a motion to void all property transactions conducted by Byron Peterson under his false identity of Byron Sutton. If the motion succeeds, and I believe it will, all your properties revert to their original owners immediately." "All of them?" Maebry felt hope surge in her chest. "Every family gets their land back?" "Every documented case where fraud can be proven, yes. It's unprecedented. But the legal argument is sound. Peterson had no authority to conduct business under a false name while evading a warrant. Therefore, his transactions are void ab initio, invalid from the beginning." Tom Brenner, who'd been listening from the doorway, let out a whoop of joy. "We won! We actually won!" "The legal battle, potentially yes," Hayes cautioned. "But Sutton himself is still at large. Until he's captured and the criminal case is resolved, there's always a risk he'll find some way to complicate matters." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a commotion erupted outside. Maebry heard shouting, the sound of horses, and Deputy Marsh's voice calling for order. She rushed to the window. In the street, 3 riders were being surrounded by deputies and armed townspeople. In the center of the group, hands bound and face blooded, sat Byron Sutton. Marsh had him by the collar, pulling him roughly from the saddle. "Caught him trying to sneak into Hamilton Greaves's office," Marsh announced. "Probably looking for evidence to destroy." Sutton's eyes found Maebry in the window, and the hatred in his gaze was palpable. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You think you've won, but I have lawyers, connections. You have warrants," Marshal Coleman interrupted, stepping forward with official papers. "Byron Peterson, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, operating under false identity, and evading justice. You'll be held here, pending extradition to Nevada Territory to stand trial." The crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers. Maebry saw Pauline Hobson in the group, tears streaming down her face. Tom Brenner was shaking hands with anyone nearby. Sophie Caldwell stood with her arm around an elderly woman who must have been her mother, both of them watching Sutton's arrest with fierce satisfaction. Hayes appeared beside Maebry at the window. "It's done," he said quietly. "He'll stand trial for the Nevada crimes, and then he'll face charges here. With Greaves's testimony and the evidence we've compiled, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison." Maebry felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for months without fully realizing it. "And our land. The Attorney General's motion will be heard next week, but with Sutton in custody and unable to mount opposition, it's essentially a formality. You'll have clear title within the month." Below, Marsh was leading Sutton toward the jail, the crowd parting to let them through. Some people shouted insults, others simply watched in grim satisfaction. This man had stolen from them, manipulated them, treated their lives and livelihoods as commodities to be exploited. Seeing him bound and defeated was justice manifest. Maebry didn't join the shouting. She simply stood at the window, watching, feeling the weight of everything that had happened since she first walked into that auction yard weeks ago. She'd come for a horse and ended up leading a movement. She'd wanted isolation and found community. She'd sought simple justice and achieved something larger. "Thank you," she said to Hayes. "For everything. For the $10 at the auction, for the legal help, for believing this fight was worth having." Hayes smiled. "Thank you for giving me the chance to repay Joseph's kindness. and for showing me that sometimes courage looks like a mountain woman refusing to surrender what's hers. Below, the jail door closed on Byron Sutton. The crowd began to disperse, people talking excitedly about what came next, about reclaimed properties and restored justice. Maebry watched it all and felt, for the first time in years, something like peace. 6 weeks after Byron Sutton's arrest, Maebry Holt stood on her porch watching the autumn colours spread across the mountain slopes. The aspens had turned gold, the scrub oak deep red, and the pine trees stood dark green against the changing landscape. It was the kind of beauty that reminded her why she'd chosen this life, why this land mattered beyond simple ownership. Rue grazed contentedly in his area, his coat thick and healthy as winter approached. He'd settled back into the rhythms of mountain life, as if the seizure and auction had never happened. Animals lived in the present, Maebry reflected. They didn't carry grudges or dwell on injustice. There was wisdom in that. On her table inside the cabin lay an official document with the territorial seal, her property deed, properly recorded, legally unassailable. Clear title to 160 acres of mountain land that she and Joseph had bought, worked, and loved. After everything that had happened, after all the fighting and fear and uncertainty, she held legal proof of what she'd always known in her heart. This land was hers. 14 other families had received similar documents in the past month. The Attorney General's motion had succeeded beyond even Warren Hayes's optimistic predictions. Not only were the Sutton-era seizures voided, but the court had ordered compensation for families who'd been displaced, with funds coming from Sutton's seized assets and the auction proceeds that Greaves had kept in various accounts. It wasn't enough to restore everything that had been lost. No amount of money could return the years of security people had missed, the stress they'd endured, the trust in systems that had been broken. But it was something. It was acknowledgement that they'd been wronged and deserved restitution. Byron Sutton himself was awaiting trial in Nevada, with additional charges pending in 3 other territories. Greaves had pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for his cooperation and received a reduced sentence of 5 years. The judge who'd signed many of the seizure orders had resigned under pressure, and there was talk of investigating other officials who might have been complicit. The legal system, for all its flaws and delays, had eventually delivered something resembling justice. Maebry heard hoofbeats on the trail and looked up to see Deputy Marsh riding toward her cabin. He'd become a regular visitor over the past weeks, checking on her welfare and bringing news from town. She suspected his concern went beyond simple duty. He'd told her once that what happened in Saddle's End had restored his faith that law enforcement could mean something real, could actually protect people, instead of just maintaining order for those already in power. "Morning, Mrs. Holt," he called as he dismounted. "Brought you something from Judge Hayes." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a letter in Hayes's careful handwriting and a photograph. The letter read, "Dear Maebry, I'm returning to Denver next week. My business in Saddle's End concluded. I wanted to leave you with this photograph, taken of Joseph and me after he pulled me from that mine shaft. I've kept it all these years, a reminder of the debt I owed and the kind of man your husband was. You've more than honored his memory through your actions. The courage you showed, the community you rallied, the justice you demanded, all of it reflects the values Joseph lived by. He would be extraordinarily proud of you. I hope we'll stay in correspondence. You've become a friend, not just the widow of a man who saved my life. Please write if you ever need anything, legal or otherwise. With deep respect and affection, Warren Hayes." The photograph showed 2 younger men, both covered in mine dust. Joseph was smiling, his arm around Hayes's shoulders in easy camaraderie. Maebry traced her finger over Joseph's face, seeing in his expression the same steady kindness that had drawn her to him all those years ago. "He looks happy," Marsh observed. "He was," Maebry said softly. Joseph was good at finding joy in small things, helping people, doing honest work, being useful. He didn't need much beyond that. She set the photograph carefully on her mantel, positioning it where she could see it from her rocking chair. Another memory preserved, another connection to the man who'd shaped so much of who she'd become. Marsh stayed for coffee, updating her on town news. Pauline Hobson and her husband had replanted their farm and were already seeing good growth. Tom Brenner was rebuilding his barn with help from neighbors. Sophie Caldwell had moved her elderly mother back to the family property and was planning to expand their small orchard. The community that had formed during the fight against Sutton hadn't dissolved once the battle was won. If anything, it had strengthened. People checked on each other, helped with harvests and repairs, gathered monthly at the town hall to share news and coordinate mutual aid. They'd asked Maebry to chair these meetings permanently, and she'd agreed on the condition that she could attend sporadically when mountain weather permitted. She still valued her solitude, still needed the quiet rhythms of her isolated life. But she'd learned that solitude didn't require complete disconnection. She could be part of a community while maintaining the independence that defined her. After Marsh left, Maebry spent the afternoon preparing her cabin for winter. She checked her food stores, repaired a loose board on Rue's shelter, split wood for the stove. Simple, necessary work that occupied her hands and settled her mind. As the sun began to set, she sat on her porch one last time before the cold would drive her inside for the season. She thought about everything that had happened since that day. She'd walked into the auction yard in her patched coat, carrying everything she owned to bid on her horse. She'd expected mockery, had received it, had pushed through it anyway. She'd expected to fight alone, had found allies instead. She'd expected to lose, had won through a combination of courage, luck, and the kindness of strangers who remembered debts and honored them. Most importantly, she'd learned that strength didn't mean never needing help. It meant knowing when to accept it, when to offer it, and when to stand firm regardless of the cost. The mountains stretched around her in the fading light, permanent and unchanging. This land would outlast her, outlast everyone who fought over it, outlast the systems and schemes that tried to control it. But while she was here, while she drew breath and worked this soil, it was hers. Truly, legally, irrevocably hers. Maebry Holt went inside as the first stars appeared, secure in her home and her place in the world. Tomorrow she would wake and tend to Rue, work her land, perhaps ride down to town if the weather held. The future stretched ahead with all its uncertainty and possibility, but tonight she was simply here, on her mountain, in her cabin, home, and that was more than enough.